It was a late autumn evening in Atlanta, the kind that carried a quiet chill even before the sun went down. The city's skyline glowed gold against the fading light, while streetlights blinked alive one by one, stretching shadows over cracked sidewalks and busy intersections. Inside the glass walls of the Avery Room, a restaurant known for its expensive wine and silent service, everything shimmered with a kind of controlled perfection. Waiters moved like whispers, the hum of conversation sat low and polite, and the faint sound of jazz tangled with the clinking of crystal. The people who came here didn't look at prices, they looked at each other. They were the kind of people who never waited in line, who never had to say, "I can't afford it." Behind the polished bar stood Maya Thompson, her black hair tied neatly at the back, her uniform pressed so tight it looked like it belonged to someone else. She moved quickly and quietly, wiping the same counter over and over even though it was already clean. She'd been working here for 3 years, long enough to know that customers didn't notice the waitress unless something went wrong. Most nights, she didn't mind that. She liked watching people, especially the rich ones. They laughed too loudly, talked too fast, and always looked a little afraid of being alone. It was a Thursday when he came in. The room felt different the moment he arrived, not because he was loud, but because people noticed. He walked in surrounded by 2 men in suits, the kind who looked like they were born with earpieces. His name was Ethan Cole. Billionaire investor, tech mogul, self-made genius. The media had called him many things. He didn't look like the pictures she'd seen online. In real life, he looked tired. There was something hollow in his face, like even the success hadn't filled him up. He had that quiet arrogance, the kind that didn't need to say much because money did the talking. Maya had seen powerful men before, but there was something strange about him that night. He wasn't there for business. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just sat at the corner table, ordered a drink he barely touched, and stared out the window like he was waiting for something or someone. The restaurant manager, nervous and eager to please, kept coming by his table to check on him. Ethan only nodded, eyes distant. Maya noticed his hands tremble slightly when he lifted the glass, not from age. From something deeper. The night was quiet until Ethan's voice cut through it. "What would you invest in?" he asked suddenly, his tone half serious, half amused. His eyes were on Maya. At first, she thought she'd misheard him. He was staring straight at her now, leaning forward with the kind of smile rich people wear when they're about to make a joke. "You look like someone good with money," he added, his words dripping with sarcasm. "If you had $1 million, what would you do with it?" A few nearby diners laughed softly, sensing the humor in it. The billionaire asking the waitress for financial advice. It was a performance, a joke for his own amusement. But Maya didn't laugh. She met his eyes, still holding the tray close to her chest. There was something in her silence that unsettled him. For a second, the air around them felt heavier. She wasn't supposed to respond, not really. She was supposed to smile and walk away. But instead, she said quietly, "I wouldn't waste it trying to fill a hole that money can't touch." The room went still. The small smiles vanished. Even Ethan stopped moving for a moment. He looked at her as if she'd said something dangerous. Then almost as quickly, he laughed, a slow, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "That's a good one," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. For the rest of the night, he kept glancing at her. Every time she walked past, his gaze followed. It wasn't desire, it was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or irritation, like she'd touched a nerve he didn't know he still had. When her shift ended past midnight, the city outside had gone quiet. Maya stood by the back door, smoking the last of a cheap cigarette, the kind that burned her throat but helped her think. She thought about what she'd said. Maybe it was too much. Maybe she'd lose her job, but for once she didn't regret it. What she didn't know was that Ethan Cole had left the restaurant just 5 minutes before her. And while he was driven away in his black car, he was already asking his assistant to find out her name. Not because he was impressed, but because something about her words bothered him. He couldn't explain why. That night, the lines between their worlds had crossed, just for a moment, but that moment would twist into something neither of them could control. By morning, the news would say that Ethan Cole had been found dead in his penthouse. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. Just a glass of untouched scotch and a phone with a single text message open on the screen. The last message he received was from an unknown number. It read, "Money can't fill a hole, Ethan." And for everyone who'd been at the Avery Room that night, it would take weeks to understand how that one short conversation turned into the kind of story that could ruin lives and reveal truths that money could never bury. The story of Ethan Cole's death didn't begin the night it ended. It started days earlier, in the quiet moments when pride and guilt began to blur together. After that strange dinner at the Avery Room, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the waitress who'd looked him straight in the eye and told him something no one else ever dared to. He replayed her words in his head, not because he wanted to, but because they struck something raw inside him. He didn't know her name yet. His assistant, David, was still digging for details, but the thought of her stayed with him like an echo he couldn't escape. Maya, meanwhile, went back to her normal life. Her apartment was small and cracked in the corners, the kind of place where the walls heard too much. She lived alone with her younger brother, Jamal, who was still in school. Most mornings, she left before he woke up, and most nights she came home when he was already asleep. She'd learned to survive by keeping her head down, but that night had left her uneasy. The billionaire's strange reaction, his eyes on her, it lingered. Not fear exactly, but a sense that something had shifted. 3 days later, Ethan showed up again. No entourage, no cameras. He sat in the same corner booth and asked for her by name. Maya froze when her manager told her, his voice almost trembling from excitement. A billionaire asking for her. It sounded like a fairy tale, but it didn't feel like one. Still, she couldn't refuse. She walked up to his table, heart steady but cautious. Ethan smiled when he saw her, but there was something forced about it. "You're hard to forget," he said softly, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Sit, just for a moment." She hesitated. "I'm working." "Then I'll pay for your time," he replied. The words were calm, but the tone carried power, habitual, casual power. He wasn't used to being told no. She sat just for a minute, her hands folded neatly on her lap. He asked questions: where she was from, how long she'd worked there, what she wanted out of life. Simple questions, but there was something almost investigative in the way he asked them. When she didn't answer fast enough, he'd study her face like she was a problem to be solved. "I don't need much," she said finally. "Just stability, peace." He tilted his head. "That's not much of a dream." "It is when you've never had it." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He laughed lightly, but it came out uneasy. That moment stuck with him, too. Her honesty, her calm, she was everything his world was. Over the next week, he came in again. And again, always late, always alone. He didn't flirt, he didn't even try to impress her. He just talked, and she listened. But it wasn't long before his conversations started to change. He told her about the company he built from nothing, about investors who betrayed him, about a lawsuit that was draining him. He spoke like a man cornered by his own success. And Maya began to see cracks in the billionaire everyone else admired. He was restless, paranoid, angry. He said he didn't trust anyone, not his partners, not his board, not even his family. "You ever feel like people love you for what you can give them?" he asked one night. "All the time," she said quietly, "but I don't have much to give." He looked at her for a long time after that, and something shifted in his eyes. Not affection, but need. A kind of emotional hunger that scared her. Soon he started asking about her life, too much. He wanted to know where she lived, who she lived with, and what she did outside work. Maya deflected, but he pressed harder each time. When she told him she was done talking, he'd back off, but never for long. One night he came in drunk. His suit was wrinkled, his tie gone. He waved off the manager and told Maya to sit. "You think you know me," he said, slurring. "You think I'm just some man with money, but you don't know what it costs. You don't know what it takes to stay on top when everyone wants a piece of you." Maya didn't respond. She learned that silence made people tell more than questions ever could. He leaned closer, voice low. "You think I can't tell when someone's lying? Everyone lies to me, but you don't. I hate that I like that." She stood up. "You should go home, Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he corrected, grabbing her wrist. It wasn't hard, but it was enough. She pulled away, eyes sharp. For a second, neither spoke. Then he blinked, realizing what he'd done. "I'm sorry," he muttered, voice shaking. "I didn't mean." "It's fine," she said, though her voice was cold. "But don't do that again." He nodded, ashamed. But after that night, something between them broke. Maya started asking for different shifts. She didn't want to see him again, yet he kept coming, leaving big tips that she refused to touch. He'd sit alone, order food he didn't eat, then disappear without a word. She told her manager she wanted to quit, but rent was late again, and Jamal needed money for school. She couldn't afford pride. Around that time, Ethan's world began to fall apart. News outlets reported that his company was under investigation for fraud, something about false accounting, shell deals, and missing funds. He denied everything, but the pressure was visible. He was losing control, and for someone who'd built his life on being untouchable, that was unbearable. Behind the headlines, Ethan was unraveling. He fired his assistant for disloyalty. He stopped answering calls. He spent hours locked in his penthouse, drinking, packing, rereading messages from people he no longer trusted. But one thread of comfort remained: Maya. She had become the only person who'd ever spoken to him without fear or flattery. Late one night, she received a message from an unknown number. It was him. "I need to see you." She almost ignored it, but part of her curiosity, maybe pity, couldn't let it go. She agreed to meet at a cafe the next afternoon. When she arrived, he looked nothing like the man she'd met weeks ago. His hair was messy, his face pale, eyes bloodshot. He talked fast, too fast, about everyone turning against him. He said he wanted to start over, to give everything away, to disappear. "You don't need money to be happy," she said softly. He smiled bitterly. "You think I don't know that now? It's just, without it, who am I?" That question hung in the air. When she stood to leave, he grabbed her hand, not roughly this time, but desperately. "You're the only person who talks to me like I'm human." She looked at him, torn between sympathy and fear. "Then start acting like one." For a moment it looked like he might cry, but instead he just nodded and let her go. After that meeting, she blocked his number. She didn't want to be part of whatever storm was coming, but Ethan couldn't let her go. He started sending letters to the restaurant to her building. They weren't threats, just fragments of his thoughts, regret, loneliness, a confession that he didn't recognize himself anymore. The last letter came the day before his death. It said, "You were right, the hole's too deep." By then, Maya had shown the letters to a coworker who told her to go to the police. But she didn't. She didn't think he'd do anything violent. She just thought he was broken. Meanwhile, his assistant David, one of the few people still around him, had started his own plan. He discovered that Ethan had transferred large sums of money into an untraceable account under Maya's name. At least that's what the documents said. But Maya had no idea. Someone was setting something in motion, and Ethan's guilt, paranoia, and obsession were only feeding it. The night before it all ended, Ethan made one last visit to the Avery Room. He sat in that same booth, staring at the door as if waiting for her. But she never came. He drank in silence until closing time, then walked out without saying a word. By morning, he was dead. And though everyone would talk about suicide, about stress, about guilt, those who'd seen the look in his eyes that night, especially Maya, knew it wasn't that simple. Something else had been there. A plan, a secret, something darker that had started long before that last drink. And the text found on his phone, the one quoting her words, wasn't sent from her number. Someone had used her name. Someone who wanted the world to believe that a waitress had been the last voice inside a billionaire's head. That was when everything began to collapse, not just for Ethan, but for Maya too. Because soon people would start asking questions. And when they did, she'd realize how deep Ethan's world had already pulled her in. The night Ethan Cole died began quietly, almost eerily so. The city was washed in rain, the kind that fell slow and steady, turning glass towers into blurred shadows. From his penthouse on the 42nd floor, Atlanta stretched out beneath him, an ocean of light he no longer felt part of. He sat near the window, drink untouched, staring at his reflection instead of the skyline. His tie was undone, his shirt half-buttoned, and his face was pale, drawn tight like a man waiting for something inevitable. The storm outside flickered through the glass, lightning flashing in his eyes every few seconds, like the world was reminding him that time was running out. On the table beside him sat a pile of documents, bank records, company emails, and printouts of transfers that led back to Maya Thompson. Her name glared at him from every page, circled in red ink. But it wasn't her doing. Ethan knew that. Somewhere in the mess of lies and betrayal, someone had used her as a scapegoat, someone close. He'd spent the last 2 nights tracing where the money really went. It led to David, his former assistant. The man he trusted more than anyone, the man who'd promised to protect him while quietly sinking the knife in deeper. Ethan had called him earlier that evening, his voice steady but dangerous. "Come over," he said. "We need to talk, alone." David arrived just after 10, shaking off the rain as he stepped into the dim apartment. He looked nervous, his smile forced. "You sounded serious, Ethan. What's going on?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He poured 2 drinks and slid one across the counter. "You've been busy," he said quietly. David blinked. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb." Ethan's tone was calm, too calm. "You moved the money, you forged the documents, you put her name on them." He pointed toward the papers on the table. You made it look like she was blackmailing me. David froze, then exhaled a shaky laugh. Ethan, you're paranoid, Don't lie to me, Ethan snapped, slamming his hand against the counter. The glass rattled. You thought I wouldn't find out? You thought I'd take the fall while you disappeared with everything I built? The silence between them turned heavy, broken only by the faint hum of rain against the glass. David's expression hardened. You were losing it, Ethan. Everyone saw it. The board wanted me to protect the company. You were the liability. Ethan stared at him, eyes burning. You sold me out. You did that yourself, David muttered. She was just a name I used to make it look real. No one would question it, a poor waitress taking advantage of a rich fool. It was perfect. The words hit harder than any blow. Maya's name twisted in Ethan's chest. For weeks, he'd blamed himself, thinking his obsession had destroyed her life. Now he realized someone else had turned his weakness into a weapon. Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropped low. You don't get to use her, not like that. David raised his hands slightly, eyes flicking toward the door. Let's calm down, we can fix this. I'll move the money back, I'll clear her name. Too late. The lightning outside flared again, casting both men in sharp light. Ethan's hand trembled around the glass, and then in one swift motion he threw it. It shattered against the wall, whiskey dripping down like blood. David flinched, instinctively reaching for his coat pocket. Don't, Ethan warned. But David's hand moved faster. A flash of metal glinted small, silver. A gun. Ethan lunged, grabbing his wrist. The two men crashed against the counter, the sound of struggle echoing through the apartment. The gun went off once, deafening. A hole was ripped through the window, shards flying everywhere. The wind howled inside, bringing the storm with it. They grappled, slipping on the wet marble floor. Ethan's strength came in bursts of rage. David tried to pull free, but Ethan shoved him hard against the glass wall. You wanted to ruin me? He shouted, voice raw. You already did. Another shot rang out. This time the bullet tore through Ethan's shoulder. He stumbled back, gripping the wound as blood soaked his sleeve. David's eyes widened, panic setting in. I didn't mean to. Ethan charged again, slamming him into the glass with everything he had. The pane cracked, spiderweb lines spreading across it like veins. They both froze, the sound of rain roaring through the open wound in the window. David's breathing turned frantic. Ethan, stop, you're bleeding, let's... But Ethan wasn't listening. He grabbed David by the collar, pressing him back against the cracking glass. His voice shook with fury and grief. You used her to cover your lies. You ruined her life. You made me believe she was the enemy. The glass gave a long, groaning sound. Ethan, David gasped, if you do this. Ethan's grip tightened. You already did. Then with one last push, the glass shattered. The sound was monstrous, a sharp, endless scream of breaking and wind and thunder. David fell backward into the night, swallowed by the dark below. For a moment, everything went silent except the rain. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, staring at the jagged hole where his assistant had been seconds before. The air rushed cold against his skin, mixing with the smell of rain and gunpowder. He sank to his knees, trembling. His mind spun in chaos. He hadn't meant to kill him, he hadn't planned it. But now the reality hit him. David was gone, and soon the world would come looking for answers. He dragged himself toward the phone, leaving a trail of blood behind. He wanted to call someone, anyone. His hand hovered over Maya's number, but what would he say? You were right. I let my anger kill someone. The words wouldn't come. He pressed his head against the cold marble, whispering her name like a prayer. Outside, sirens began to echo faintly in the distance. Someone in another building must have heard the gunshots. Panic started to flood through him. The gun was still on the floor, the documents still covered in her name. Anyone who walked in would see what David had done, but not the truth, not the struggle, not the fall. He stumbled toward the table, knocking over bottles, papers scattering everywhere. He grabbed the documents with her name, tried to burn them in the sink, but the lighter slipped through his shaking hands. The flame caught for a moment, then died. His vision blurred, the bleeding hadn't stopped. He pressed his hand against the wound, staggering toward the couch. He could barely breathe now. Somewhere deep inside, guilt began to twist through the shock. I ruined everything. I let him make her part of this. His phone buzzed on the floor. A new message, unknown number. He picked it up with trembling fingers. The text was short. You were supposed to keep quiet. The words didn't make sense at first. Then another message followed. You think David worked alone. Ethan's chest tightened. There was more. Someone else had been part of it, someone who was still watching. He looked toward the broken window, half expecting to see a shadow, but there was nothing, just the city lights blurred by rain. He typed a reply, his blood smearing across the screen. "Who are you?" No answer, just silence. Ethan dropped the phone, his strength fading fast. He sat there for a long moment, eyes unfocused, until his gaze fell on the message thread with Maya, the last thing that had felt real. Without thinking, he opened it and started typing, even as his fingers slipped on the keys. "Money can't fill a hole, Ethan." He read it once, then twice, before realizing it wasn't him typing anymore. The screen flickered, like someone else had sent it remotely. His heart stopped. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The last thing Ethan Cole saw before the world went black was the rain washing his reflection away from the glass. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found a shattered window, a body on the street below, and another slumped inside the penthouse, bleeding out beside a phone still lit with that one haunting message. And by morning, the headlines would tell a story no one truly understood. Billionaire found dead after apparent murder-suicide. Waitress linked to mysterious final message. But Maya hadn't sent it. She was at home, asleep beside her brother, unaware that the nightmare she'd been trying to escape had just found her again. By dawn, the city that once worshipped Ethan Cole woke to the sound of sirens and scandal. News anchors spoke his name like a broken hymn, flashing his smiling face beside images of shattered glass and flashing red lights. The words billionaire and dead didn't seem to fit in the same sentence, yet there it was, looping on every screen, tech mogul Ethan Cole found dead in an apparent murder-suicide. His assistant's body had been found 40 floors below, and inside the penthouse, police discovered Ethan with a gunshot wound, a pool of blood, and a phone displaying one cryptic text. Detectives worked quickly to piece together what happened, but the evidence told a story that didn't add up. The scene looked staged, 2 glasses of whiskey, documents with Maya's name, and a gun wiped mostly clean. The text, "Money can't fill a hole, Ethan," tied her directly to the case, even though the timestamp didn't match the timeline of death. But details rarely mattered when the story was this sensational. Within hours, the media had already decided who she was, the mysterious waitress who caught a billionaire's attention and drove him to madness. Maya woke up that morning to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop, missed calls, texts, and one headline that made her blood run cold. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the photo of Ethan's penthouse glowing on her screen. For a long time, she didn't move. Her brother Jamal stumbled out of his room, rubbing his eyes. "What's wrong?" She couldn't answer. The world had already started painting her as the villain. By afternoon, police showed up at her door. They were calm but firm, their questions sharp. Had she seen him recently? Did she send the message? Did she know about the money transfers? Maya's denial only seemed to make them more suspicious. She told them about the letters, about the harassment, about how she'd blocked him, but it didn't matter. Someone had planted enough digital evidence to make her look guilty. They searched her phone, her apartment, and even her locker at the restaurant. Her coworkers stared as they led her out in handcuffs, cameras flashing through the front windows. For a woman who had lived her life quietly, invisibly, suddenly everyone saw her. The girl who had talked back to power. The woman who'd played a billionaire. The internet tore her apart. Some called her manipulative. Others called her brave. A few defended her, saying there was no proof, but truth never traveled as fast as scandal. Overnight, Maya became a symbol of everything people loved and hated about the divide between rich and poor. But the truth was simpler. She was scared, angry, lost. In the interrogation room, the detective across from her kept his tone steady. "The messages came from your number." She shook her head. "I didn't send them. They were logged from your account. Then someone used it." "Who would do that?" Maya hesitated. Her first thought was David, the assistant, but he was gone. Then she remembered the second message Ethan received that night. "You think David worked alone?" She told them about it, but the detective's face didn't change. "We'll look into it," he said flatly, the way people talk when they've already made up their minds. When they released her that night, the reporters were waiting. Microphones shoved toward her, questions shouted like accusations. "Did you kill him? Were you having an affair? Did he give you money?" She pushed through the crowd without answering, eyes fixed on the ground. The restaurant fired her the next morning. "We can't have this kind of attention," the manager said quietly, not meeting her eyes. She just nodded. She'd already expected it. The days that followed blurred together. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the moment he'd looked at her and said she was the only one who talked to him like a human. Now he was gone, and somehow everyone thought she'd been the last voice in his head. Across the city, the people who once envied Ethan Cole began tearing him apart. Old business partners distanced themselves, calling him unstable. Investors blamed his emotional weaknesses. His death became gossip instead of a tragedy. The empire he'd built began to crumble piece by piece as the investigation deepened. But in the midst of the chaos, small cracks began to appear in the story. Forensic analysts discovered that the message on Ethan's phone had been sent after his time of death. The location data didn't match Maya's apartment. The transfer logs tied to her name were traced to a shadow account created using company credentials belonging to David. The police quietly corrected their narrative, but by then the public had already moved on. Apologies didn't make headlines. Maya still couldn't walk outside without whispers following her. Strangers stared. Some recognized her from the photos. She started wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, even on cloudy days. Her brother stopped going to school for a while after classmates started asking if his sister was a murderer. At night, she sat by the window, staring at the lights of the city. The same city that had crushed Ethan Cole under its weight. She thought about how close she'd come to being part of his downfall, and how easily the world could twist one conversation into a weapon. Weeks passed before she received a letter. No return address, just her name written in careful, familiar handwriting. Inside was a single line. He wasn't supposed to die that way. There was no signature, but she knew. Someone else had been involved. Someone who'd planned to destroy Ethan, not kill him. Maybe another partner, maybe someone higher up. Someone who wanted both men gone and her left to take the blame. She took the letter to the police, but they barely looked at it. The case was officially closed, a murder-suicide brought on by guilt and stress. Ethan's fortune was tied up in lawsuits, his company in shambles. The world had already moved to the next story. Maya didn't. She couldn't. Everywhere she went, she felt his shadow. The memory of his tired eyes, his trembling hands. She hated him for what he'd done, for how he'd pulled her into his mess, but she also pitied him. He'd been a man who'd gained everything and lost himself in the process. Months later, she visited his grave for the first time. It was quiet, the city far behind her, the sky gray and still. The headstone was simple, just his name, birth year, and death date. No grand gesture, no epitaph. She stood there for a long time, unsure what to say. "I didn't forgive you," she whispered finally, "but I understand you." The wind picked up softly, scattering leaves across the ground. As she walked away, she felt something shift, not peace exactly, but release. She couldn't change what happened. She couldn't clear her name in everyone's eyes, but she could choose to live past it. Somewhere in the distance, the rain began again, steady and quiet, washing the city clean. For Ethan, for David, and for her, it was too late for redemption. But for the first time since that night, Maya felt the faintest trace of what she'd told him she wanted most. Stability. Peace. When the trial finally began, the air in the courtroom was thick with curiosity and judgment. Reporters crowded every bench, their pens ready to twist every word into headlines that would sell. People wanted to see the man who had fallen from unimaginable wealth to public disgrace, and the woman who had once been invisible now standing at the center of it all. What started as a cruel joke in a restaurant had spiraled into something neither of them could have foreseen: ruin, guilt, and loss. Calvin Hart sat silently beside his lawyers, his once polished confidence replaced by the hollow stillness of a man stripped of control. He no longer wore the arrogance that used to hang off him like a tailored suit. His wealth couldn't buy silence this time. His face was thinner, his eyes heavy with the kind of sleeplessness that came from knowing he'd destroyed everything, not because of greed, but pride. Across the courtroom, Maya James sat composed but distant, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat or tremble, she simply looked tired. Years of battling for her name and dignity had taken their toll. The evidence was brutal. Financial records, witness testimonies, and audio clips from his assistant, all showing how Calvin had tried to manipulate Maya after their confrontation went public. His empire had collapsed under the weight of investigations that uncovered years of deceit, and his friends in high places had quietly turned away, unwilling to be burned by his downfall. Maya had become the face of something larger than herself, proof that one person's courage could challenge power. But she didn't want fame or praise. She had lost her peace, her privacy, and at times her will to keep fighting. Even after being vindicated, she still woke up some nights shaking, haunted by how close she came to being erased by a system that never took her seriously until she forced it to. The final verdict came down hard. Calvin was sentenced to years in prison for fraud, coercion, and tampering with evidence. His company was dissolved, his assets liquidated. Cameras flashed as he was led away, his wrists bound, his name forever tarnished. For someone who had once controlled the fate of thousands, the silence of his end was almost poetic. But the truth was, justice didn't bring peace. It simply marked the end of a storm that left both lives in pieces. Maya didn't attend the sentencing. She had stopped following the case months earlier, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding what little of herself was left. She moved to a small town upstate, far from cameras and gossip, where people didn't recognize her face or whisper her name. She took a job teaching financial literacy at a community center, helping others who'd been ignored or overlooked like she once was. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about healing. Sometimes she thought back to that night at the restaurant, the way he had laughed, the smug sparkle in his eyes when he asked her for financial advice. The memory used to make her angry, now it only made her sad, because somewhere deep down she had realized that Calvin Hart wasn't evil in the way villains are written. He was empty. He had built his empire on the idea that money could fill that emptiness, that power could give him meaning. But when he lost both, he had nothing left to hold on to. For her, the real punishment wasn't the years he'd serve. It was knowing he'd finally have to sit with the truth of who he was. In the months that followed, the world moved on to new scandals and newer faces to admire or condemn. But the story of the billionaire and the waitress lingered, not because it was sensational, but because it hit something raw in people. It reminded them how fragile dignity is, how easily the powerful can twist it, and how rarely justice feels complete. Critics and talk shows tried to frame the story as one of class warfare, a modern parable about privilege meeting truth. But those who had really followed it knew it wasn't that simple. It was about what happens when human decency gets lost in the chase for status, and when arrogance blinds someone to the humanity standing right in front of them. Maya never gave another interview. When asked by a reporter outside her new job why she refused to capitalize on her fame, she said quietly, "Because I don't want my pain to be a brand." That single sentence traveled far beyond what she intended. It sparked conversations online about ethics, power, and the way society romanticizes suffering when it comes from the poor, but condemns it when it challenges the rich. Her name became a symbol, not of revenge, but of quiet strength. Years later, when Calvin was released from prison, he didn't return to the public eye. He bought a small house by the coast, away from the cities where his name was once carved in glass. He lived alone, avoided the press, and spent most of his days staring out at the ocean. Some said he found religion, others said he went mad. The truth probably lived somewhere in between. What no one could deny was that he was no longer the man who once believed the world was his to own. If there was a lesson in it all, it wasn't about money or race or scandal. It was about humanity's blindness to humility. One careless act of mockery had destroyed 2 lives and exposed the rot beneath society's obsession with wealth and appearance. Maya carried her scars quietly, refusing to let them define her. Calvin carried his publicly, unable to hide from what he'd done. And the world, ever hungry for entertainment, moved on without really learning. Justice in the end wasn't clean. It never is. It was messy, painful, and incomplete, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all people like Maya ever get.